Hello, and welcome to day 15 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. Today we're going to look at Blockade, and you can see here that it's black to move, so if you want to pause the video now, you can do that and go through the four-step thought process. So a blockade is basically when you use one of your pieces to cut off a square or a pawn and prevent it from advancing. But in these advanced tactics, it can get a little more complicated. Basically, you can use one of your pieces or force an opponent's piece to blockade a square that the king needs or another piece needs, and we'll just go through and see what each specific situation represents for the blockade. Alright, so you could see that black to move, that he has his rook on the 7th, and of course he can take the queen here, but it looks like there was a queen trade, and we want to figure out what we're going to do, but we're going to start with step 1 of the thought process. So if it was white to move, just as an example, we see that he can bring his queen to check, he can take the knight, and he could also take the rook, of course. So there's multiple captures that either we need to make a stronger threat or we just need to take the queen. So we'll move on to step 2 to find the candidates. Now, notice that the king over here in the corner is heavily surrounded by all of black's pieces. These two knights are looking to cut in to this territory and checkmate the king or just win a lot of material. And there's also a check here. So we notice that our candidates, there's really no king move. There is a check with the bishop. There's also a check with the rook, but there's two captures there. So that doesn't really lead to anything, but we still need to keep that in mind. There's also rook takes queen, and there's knight to f3. So, and of course there's knight here, so we'll look at that really quickly. Alright, so the first move that we'll look at, if we go to step 3 for calculation, is we'll look at rook takes queen. So rook takes queen, the bishop or the knight could take. Now we want to look if there's a possible checkmate. Now we could bring the knight in or we could check. So rook takes queen, now the bishop would have to take, because if the knight takes, for example, then we just have a fork, forking the king and the bishop. So white can't take with the knight, he has to take with the bishop. And we'd love to play check here, but of course the king can just escape. Another thing we like to do is to play knight to f3, and it looks like we have a possible mate, but of course if we do that, then we leave this knight undefended, and the bishop can just take it, and now we don't have that knight to check on f2 for mate. So we can evaluate that rook takes queen just leads to an even situation. And actually it could get quite dangerous because white has his passed pawn that he's threatening to usher in, and all our pieces are on the wrong side. So we'll look for something else. Bishop check, the knight can take. Now if this bishop wasn't covering this square, then it would actually be a blockade and we'd have a checkmate with the knight sitting here, the pawn. But of course the bishop's covering this square, so it doesn't necessarily work. So we'll look at knight check, because it's another check. Now, of course, he could just take with the pawn, and now our rook's undefended, and we don't really have any other moves, so that doesn't lead to anything. Another move we want to look at is knight to f3. Now, if the queen takes, then actually he just forced checkmate upon himself with the knights, so that's pretty good. Now, we're also threatening to checkmate along this file if the queen moves. If the bishop takes, then we actually just have, for example, if the bishop takes here, we have check and then mate there. So he can't take that hanging knight. What if the queen escapes with a check? That looks pretty scary. we don't want to move the king back here because he can just keep checking. Well, he wouldn't go there, but he'd go forward. We'll see if we move here that it's an escape check. So then now what? Well, it looks like he has to keep the checks going because the queen either has to move back because we're threatening mate on h2. So he's forced to check, try to drive the bishop away, but we're still threatening mate. So the queen can come back and check. We can either move the pawn up, we can move the king up, or we can move this knight back. If we move the pawn up, he can take, but we still have checkmate. Let's say if we just bring the knight back here, then what does he do? So if the queen is forced to either move here, which actually would result in checkmate. So if the queen came here, we could either just take it, and then we check here. Alright, so the queen is forced to play queen to c2. Now, do we want to take? Not yet. Let's say. So we can put our knight here, and then we can threaten checkmate with the bishop and the knight coming in here. So now we're threatening check, the king moves, and then we have the checkmate that we saw before. So you can see the calculation aspect can get quite deep. We're trying to evaluate candidates at every single step. And keep in mind that we're at this initial position. So it's a couple moves before. So all the candidates, rook takes queen, we discounted. Knight takes g3 check, we discounted. Rook to g2 check, we discounted. And so by a process of elimination, we're left with knight to f3, which is the only move that results in a win. So at this point, step 4, we go to the blunder check, and we see that if we play knight to f3, the only other move, well, the bishop can take, but then we'd have checkmate after bishop to g2 check, which we evaluated, or rook takes queen. So the only other forcing move after knight to f3 is queen takes rook, which results in checkmate, or check, which we can escape. So at this point, we'd play it after a blunder check, and that's basically the end of the 4-step thought process. And you can see that step 3, we spent the most time. So when you get to step 3, you should already have the candidates in mind, and you'll spend a lot of time, and that's where you make mistakes. That's where what you're really practicing is the calculation aspect. And eventually your visualization abilities will get up there as well. All right, so we're going to move on to position 1 that you can solve, and we'll go through that again. So I'm going to present 2 positions to you, and this first one is white to move, and you can pause the video now if you want to solve it. Okay, so in this position, starting from step 1, with white to move, we want to evaluate black's threats first. You can see that the black queen is hitting this rook along the light square diagonal. And also the rook is threatening the white queen. So we'd be screwed if it was black to move, but luckily it's white to move, so we have more options. Now, in terms of our candidate moves, there's basically queen takes rook is a candidate because it's a check, and there's also knight to e7 and knight to f6 check. So we'll evaluate basically these 3 candidates before anything else. So what about queen takes rook? Let's see. So if we do queen takes rook, king takes. All right, well, there's nothing because we don't have any other checks, and the queen's hitting this rook, so we just gave away our queen for a rook. So we'll discount that candidate. Of course, there's queen to f7 check in terms of the accuracy of my complete thought process. So Obviously, just your intuition will lead you to that being ridiculous. It doesn't lead to anywhere. But of course, in step 2, as I said before, you want to be open to every possibility. So the other option is knight to e7. Now, there's only 2 possibilities. Either the knight takes or the king moves, and we end up with checkmate because he steps away from protection of the rook. So let's evaluate that. Now, if the knight takes, then what do we have? Of course, the queen can take the knight, but we want to always look at the end of the line. That would result in checkmate for black, and we'd lose. So we know we can't take the knight. What else can we do? We can take the rook, and this is where you still want to follow the step 2 and step 3 along with your calculation. Now, this is the hard part of calculation, is finding candidates at each step. Because as you go deeper, of course, it's harder to visualize and harder to figure out the possibilities. But of course, I'm moving the pieces so you can see it clearly, so you can understand how this process works. Now, queen takes rook. You need to visualize that the knight is blockading this square, and with these pawns, there's a back rank mate. So from the beginning position, you can see that knight to e7 leads to checkmate, because if the knight doesn't take, if the king moves back, then we just simply take the rook and checkmate the black king. All right, so from this initial position, you can see that we decided on knight to e7. Now we also saw that knight to e6 was a possibility, but we can quickly see that the pawn would just take, and we just gave away a knight for nothing. In addition to allowing black to have a escape square, we have no other threats other than to move the queen back and be down a knight. So we decided on knight to e7. Now let's look at all the forcing possibilities. We'll visualize that move. We see that there's only knight takes e7 and the king moves back. So at that point, we would determine that there's no other forcing opportunities and we'd play the move. All right, moving on to position 2. In position 2 here, it is white to move, and you can pause the video now. All right, so you can see that there's quite a lot of piece activity from white's side, and there's some opportunities for black as well. So starting from step 1, you can see that black has multiple threats with the queen, and that's pretty much all, because the bishop's cut off by the knight. The knight doesn't really have any squares to move because the queen's covering one and this pawn is covering these 2 squares. And the rooks are just sitting passively. Now, of course, this knight is here, but it's not really doing anything. So we pretty much just have to evaluate what the queen's threatening. We can see that the queen is threatening queen to c5 check. So at step 1, you can follow the same process you use in step 2 to find candidates for your own moves. Now, if you notice that my thought process, step 1 and step 4, half of the steps focus on the opponent's possibilities. Now that's because in chess, your opponent has an equal say, that half of their moves and half of your moves. Each move is just a half move from each opponent. So you want to dedicate the same mental resources finding your opponent's possibilities as your own. So queen to c5 is a check. You're looking for all checks, captures, and threats from your opponent. Just wanted to make that point there. So also the queen can take the pawn, and he can take this pawn. So other than that, there's really no other threats. So once we've noted those, we can move on to find our own threats. Now, it looks like this knight on f5 is very securely posted, and it looks like we're trying to get a mating attack somehow, and we want to find all the aggressive possibilities. Of course, there's bishop takes. The rooks don't really have any aggressive moves yet. We could make a normal move, bringing the rook in and protecting a pawn, or we could bring our rook up, but we're not looking at those yet. We're looking at all the checks, captures, and threats. So there's bishop takes f7 check. There's knight to e7, knight to h6. And in terms of threats, there's bishop to f6, which might seem ridiculous at first, but we should look at all these. So we have 4 possibilities here. We can quickly discount bishop takes f7 because you can see that the rook would just take and there's nothing else. So I'll play it out here. Bishop takes, rook takes. What do we have? There's really no forcing replies that lead anywhere. All right, so we could discount bishop takes f7. How about knight to e7? Of course, the knight could just take, and we're left with nothing. Notice that this bishop is pinned as well. All right, how about knight to h6? Pawn can take, queen can take. That might be a possibility, but does the pawn have to take? Not necessarily. So it looks like we're threatening to play bishop f6, but we see that the queen can just come back. So that doesn't lead to anything either. All right, so we've discounted knight to h6. Now the only other move that is a very forcing move is bishop to f6. Now this might seem ridiculous at first, but let's calculate it out. So bishop to f6. There's 2 possibilities, actually 3. So the pawn can take, the queen can take, or the queen can play queen to c5 check, winning this bishop. So we need to make sure that this idea could possibly work. We need to calculate further. So in this thought process, you can see that I eliminated possibilities that don't work. And when you're looking at all possibilities, you want to kind of follow the trail down as far as it goes. So if you see something that is kind of unclear, you want to keep looking at it. So let's visualize the position after queen to c5. The king can move, or the rook can interpose, but we'll just move the king out of the way. And if the queen takes the bishop, what moves do we have? Now we can play knight to h6 check, and if he takes, then we'd actually get a mating attack. There's no way he could stop queen to g7 mate, but he doesn't have to play that. He can just move the king over, and we don't really have anything. So we'll look for a more forcing move. If queen h6 check, or queen to h6, threatening queen to g7 mate. Now if he takes, then it's actually checkmate because the bishop's covering this diagonal and the knight's checking the king. So that does work. Now let's go back a few moves. So we can see that if we end up at this position, we have queen to h6. So that's the most forcing continuation. But that's actually a mistake by black. What if he takes with the pawn? Then actually the pawn's not covering h6, so we can move the queen in, and now there's no way for black to prevent checkmate other than sacrificing his queen. Of course, we'll bring our rook in. Now you can keep evaluating or keep calculating, but you can quickly evaluate just based on the material. So the quantitative factor in this position, you could see that rook, minor piece. So basically black lost, or black traded his queen for 2 minor pieces. A definite disadvantage. Now this position here might be a little complicated to play, but it looks like we have a mating attack along here, and it'll be hard for black to compensate for his material disadvantage as well as his weak pawn structure. Now what if he takes with his queen? Did we just give away a bishop? You can see that the rook, there's a discovery. And if he takes, then we actually just win the queen, and we're in the same position. He just lost a queen for 2 minor pieces. So it might seem kind of shocking, but this kind of move. Now the computer has another suggestion as bishop to d5, but of course it's not as forcing. And when you're playing against a human opponent, or even against any opponent really, you're going to play the most forcing continuation. Now it's interesting that the computer suggests something like this, just to cut the queen off and increase the pressure, but a human wouldn't really play that way. You can see that through my thought process, you actually found a forcing continuation that wins, based on the computer's evaluation even, and it does so by following the principles of activity. In step 2, finding candidates, forcing candidates. So you can see that looking for the most forcing replies, you use your calculation to eliminate certain ideas, and you find the most forcing one that leads to the best evaluation. So in this position, the blunder check that you do after deciding to play bishop to f6, you looked at queen c5 already, so we know that that works, but you just want to clearly re-visualize it and make sure that at the end of this line, after queen to c5 check, that you do have queen to h6. You just want to double check, and we do. So other than queen takes, pawn takes, there's really no other forcing move, because we're forcing to take the queen, or we're threatening to take the queen with the bishop. So black has to do something. Black has to respond to this threat against his queen. Either remove it or take it. And that's the power of forcing moves in these positions, is that you force the opponent to do something that you can easily determine an evaluation of. Alright, so this is it for the 3 positions for Blockade. Let me know if you have any questions, and leave a comment if you have any questions about any of these positions or the thought process to apply it. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.